Hey everyone, ScowlingAl here, and I'm gonna apologize for the sound quality here. I got my AC unit on. It's loud as fuck, but I'm really hot, so we're gonna deal with it. I'm gonna try to edit out as much of it as possible, but anyway. I think it's time we make a video setting ourselves straight for y'all. Anyone who's familiar with our channel has, since our first video has been published up until now, seen us espouse many different political opinions. We've touched on topics like free speech and political correctness, how we feel towards conservatism and religion and all that kind of stuff, and we've done that the whole time thinking we were coming from a leftist perspective. However, LordMikeBedlam and I have been on a journey for the past few years, starting slightly before we made the Podunk punks, and that journey has kind of lifted the curtain for us and shown us a lot of things we've never taken into full consideration. And because we feel that many people may be where we were at not too long ago, we think it might do some good to explain how and why we've traveled our journey and why it's ultimately a great journey to go on for those genuinely interested in seeing where their political notions ultimately lead to. So, before we get into the start of our journey, let me explain what sent us on that journey in the first place. We were two friends that had decided that we wanted to make an entertainment show. You know, we thought about what kind of specific entertainment we wanted to be and couldn't really decide on any one thing, so we decided to make our show a variety show. Something where we just find anything important, absurd, fascinating, informational, etc., and present it to people in a fairly comedic way. So there we were, lost in a forest of media trying to find our niche, you know? And along the way, we found a lot of crazy stuff, and among the crazy stuff, some of it was political. Now, everyone knows the more time you spend making fun of surface-level political stuff, the more you end up actually being exposed to the deeper concepts. You know, one day, you might be making fun of some guy sitting in a pickup truck saying the N-word and do his telephone, and then, before you know it, there's Stefan Molyneux explaining white ethno-states to you. You know, so in short, we got exposed to a lot in a very short amount of time, and having this podcast has brought us to the sidelines of a political arena that we weren't fully equipped to judge correctly. You know, we were one of those people who didn't know much, but we knew we hated most things conservatives stood for. Big business, unbreakable ties to religion and tradition, wanting to take away women's rights, etc. And thus, we knew we were to the left of them on the political spectrum, and here's where our journey, the Podunk Punks journey, truly starts. The journey along and the unveiling of the true political spectrum. You see, when most people grow up here in the US, our two-party system trains you to believe that there's a polar political battle taking place where the Democrats stand for the left and the Republicans stand for the right, and independents are just kind of this hopeless pipe dream stuck in limbo. Thus, what stays in scope is this left versus right dichotomy where you have to pick a side, and if you're going to pick a side on the left, Democrats are the way to go. So, Mike and I grew up as Democrats. Sure, the Democratic Party does things from time to time we may not agree with, but, you know, you pick the least evil person within that bunch, cross your fingers, and hope that, in the end, they represent as much of the opposite of the other side as possible. Well, after a while of doing that, we started to notice something peculiar. Both sides aren't really that much different from each other. They both think that systematic problems require individual solutions. You know, no, it's not the US military complex coupled with rampant, excessive capitalism that's making the world a dirty place. It's you, going out to the grocery store and buying all that cheap plastic and your hesitancy to recycle. It's not the overall system that needs to change, it's you. Also, check out this commercial where we try to sell you a bunch of cheap plastic stuff. You know, that's the kind of shit that Democrats think of as a green movement, and what Republicans think of as a huge concession on their part. Oh man, we're gonna start more recycling initiatives. What a huge blow to business that'll be. But, you know, capitalism and bigger picture structures hadn't really occurred to us yet. Mike and I just knew that Democrats tended to loosely, generally hold some stances we value, but in the end are just as prone to going back on their word as anyone else. This meant that we kind of started feeling woke. You know, like we were fighting for the right side while also being able to point out any flaws that our side may have as well. And this made us adopt a lot of that centrist mentality of, oh, everyone calm down, you know, it's all bullshit anyway. And you see, that statement is as wrong as it is right. Yes, the system we're presented with is bullshit, and that deserves to be addressed as such, but once the scope widens to see the full picture, it turns out not to all be bullshit. You see, they want people to adopt that mentality of, oh, neither side works for me, so fuck it all, in hopes that we can't perceive anything as a better option. You know, they want They want us to give up and capitulate to the dichotomies that they put forth, and they frame the conversation entirely around that dichotomy so that anything outside of that dichotomy can be deemed radical. This is what's known as the Overton window. The Overton window is defined as, quote, the spectrum of ideas on public policy and social issues considered acceptable by the general public at a given time, end quote. So the size and placement of the window changes depending on the place and time period you're looking at, but basically, it encompasses everything that a country's government spends its time addressing. Non-Compete has a great explanation of the Overton window that you can watch if you're interested in learning more about it, but anyway, the Overton window acts as kind of a funnel, which deems certain things mainstream and others radical, and a lot of people get conditioned into thinking that the middle of the road is the best place to be, but since the middle of the road of the Overton window can be over any part of the spectrum, what you might perceive to be centrism is actually farther to one side than you might think. In other words, it doesn't matter that you're a centrist in your culture, because a centrist in one culture might be a radical in another. Well, back to our story. Since we live under a country that works hard to make sure its Overton window stays as the representation of its entire political spectrum, we essentially didn't know that being to the left of the Democratic Party was really a thing that could happen in the US. We didn't know much about socialism and all the flavors that it comes in, and it's no wonder since all the airtime on political networks is taken up almost entirely by Democrats and Republicans. Thus, our view of people to the left of Democrats were people who just wanted to be different and edgy, we figured we get it. Nobody truly likes their political party, so just pick one based off your general leanings and write letters to your representatives if you want your party to change, yada yada yada, Again, we had been conditioned to think that if you want to be taken seriously politically, you just had to choose one of those two sides. We bought into the dichotomy, hook, line, and sinker. And thus, we didn't have much exposure to actual leftists, and that meant that we didn't have anyone explaining to us the intricate details of how interwoven everything is and how easy it is to cause detriment to entire groups of people. You know how it's said that every girl needs a gay best friend? Well, I think every YouTube commentator needs a leftist best friend. You see, when we first made the Podunk Punks, Mike and I were watching a lot of Joe Rogan and the Drunken Peasants and whatnot. And, they all kind of identify as left or center-left people, and since we identified as center-left or liberal, we kind of emulated their style a bit. We were free speech absolutists, out to make the point that, while yes, we are a part of what we perceive to be the left, they can be just as bad as the right. And this led us to do all kinds of stupid things, like say that Antifa and the KKK were equivalent, and think that we could get away with saying things like faggot and retard, and get away with it because, we weren't using them to actually refer to gays or handicapped people. We were using the words ironically to describe overly straight people and people who should be smarter than the things that end up coming out of their mouths, We wouldn't actually use those words to put anyone down to their face, We have gay friends and handicapped family members that we love dearly. So, playfully, we went forward with the show, making fun of stupid shit that Trump says, along with making fun of those purple-haired campus screamers that can be found in SJW compilations and all kinds of other stuff. We took the high road, calling Trump a fucking retard, and since Pence hates gay people, we called him a fag, because we knew he'd hate it. The problem with these words is that they are, at the end of the day, slurs that, for some people, resonate very deeply and can cause an upwelling of negative thoughts and emotions, and ultimately serve to foster and enable environments where those words can be used very maliciously. We were free speech absolutists, thinking that everyone's words are just as strong as everyone else's, and if you have a problem, just speak out about it, and the free marketplace of ideas will boost your message forward. Well, it turns out us tossing out words like retard and faggot can have a silencing effect on minorities, no matter how we use it. And as long as those words are being used, it puts a barrier between us and people who have personal connections with those words, and ultimately makes us less accessible. One thing that didn't feel right to me was how we have a bunch of gay and trans friends who we absolutely love and support. Meanwhile, we kick back and call people faggots on our show. I just didn't see how we could balance that out, and once that started to click, I worked on eliminating that kind of stuff from my vocabulary. I'm still working on it. Mike's doing his best too. You see, this is what's wrong with the generation that was raised on South Park and the Mind of Mencia and shit like that. We hear words get tossed around and we become desensitized to them because the words don't actually apply to us. But for the people those words were actually designed for, it can cut really deep. So, on one hand, you have people actually hurt by these words that make fun of things they can't choose, and on the other hand, you have people going, well, suck it up, words are just words. And what I personally have learned from all of this is that nobody gets to dictate what is and isn't offensive to other people. If someone finds something offensive, you should evaluate what you're doing and take the least dickish route. And chances are, you'll find that taking the least dickish route ends up with a lot more positive interactions with other people. For instance, if I say, wow, this is retarded, and someone says, hey, I have a cousin who has a form of mental retardation, can you not say that, please? My answer shouldn't be, well, sorry about your cousin, but that's just my freedom of speech, sorry, can't change it. No, the least dickish route would be, oh shit, my bad, I didn't mean that, maybe I'll think twice before I say that word. Because you should think twice before using words like that. There's 7.5 billion people on the globe, and they're all different, and you're gonna come in contact with a lot of different people. It's just the way things are now. The world isn't as sectioned off as it was in the past. Things are more global now, and we're forced to commingle now, and that's a good thing. As a country, we're learning a great lesson in being forced to put our differences aside, and the result, overall, is a positive one. So, this is Lord Mike Bedlam and I saying, we're sorry. We apologize for letting certain things slip out of our mouths. We never held the intention of excluding anyone or oppressing anyone or creating an environment where minorities feel unwelcome. We're punks, and making minorities feel uncomfortable is about as least punk as it gets. Punk has always been about standing up for those who don't have a voice. The only minority we should make uncomfortable is the 1%, the asshole billionaires. This show has always supported people of all stripes. Our co-host, Alfonso, is gay. We've interviewed and promoted bands with trans members, and the only people we have ever put down about their sexuality are people like that Pastor Dave Grisham guy, who thinks that trans people reading books to children is a sign of the apocalypse. We've always hated the overly and overtly straight, macho, jockey douchebags. Remember that one congressman who didn't like that one guy putting his hand on his arm and was like, sir, you might like that, but I have a wife.
Proceed on this one. I hear you. I understand there's some hard feelings with PennDOT.
Representative Bradford,
Yes.
just look, I'm a heterosexual. I have a wife. I love my wife. I don't like men, as you might, but don't stop touching me.
Yeah, fuck that guy. Anyway, Mike and I acknowledge that we may have cultivated an atmosphere that feels uncomfortable for some people, and that small instances of slurs being used can create a silencing effect for marginalized people. Thus, we're going to actively work to control our vocabulary. ContraPoints has an absolutely amazing video that details how not all free speech is created equally, and just how important it is to protect marginalized groups. Anyway, back to our story. So here we were, center-left free speech absolutists, positive that what we were doing was the right thing. Sure, we're vulgar and might say fag or retard from time to time, but have you seen people on the right? They're the ones who actually want to harm gay people and fuck healthcare up. Surely that made us the knights in shining armor in the situation. This is me rolling my eyes at ourselves in the past. Well, one day, or across a series of days, ScowlingAl, I, was scrolling around YouTube and found the channel PhilosophyTube. I've always enjoyed dabbling in philosophy here and there, but had never really gone too far down that rabbit hole. Well, I stumbled across Ali's video about the philosophy of Antifa, and his other video on what liberalism used to be, and this opened me up to so many things that had just never clicked before. Remember what I said about the Overton window conditioning us to not see the entire actual political spectrum? Well, I began to see that things our society deemed radical, aka socialism, communism, Marxism, anarchism, were all actually very well thought out positions with one main thing in common: a critique or refutation of capitalism. And that's when I had a huge moment of clarity. The reason why Democrats seemed to just be another cog in the machine was because they were, along with Republicans. They work within the confines of capitalism, and no matter how many times capitalism fails, they resuscitate it. Sure, they may be the party that wants more regulations on capitalism, but they still want capitalism around, and I'll give a really entry-level explanation on why that's a bad thing. In very Richard Wolffian terms, capitalism worked well for a bit, but now the wheels are coming off. In capitalism, the capitalists, aka business owners, get to own the means of production, which are the farms, the processing plants, the refineries, etc. And the workers make products using those means of production that the capitalists can then sell. The product is sold for more than what it costs to make, and whatever is left over is profit. The majority of that profit goes to the capitalist, and the capitalists all compete to out-profit one another. Now, these capitalists, keep in mind, own the mass media, the tech companies, they are the big in big pharma, etc. This means that they can essentially control pretty much everything for their own benefit without any regard for the welfare of anyone but the capitalists. This is why our world is increasingly turning into a world of screens and ads. The capitalists want your attention everywhere you go. Watch the video I put out about woke businesses like Gillette if you want to know more about how insidious advertising can be. Anyway, the main point of capitalism is to increase profit and cut costs, and since the main cost of running a business tends to be having to pay workers for their labor, that means the main way to cut costs is to pay your workers the bare minimum or say fuck them all together and invest in automation. This means that treating your employers like shit is almost a requirement for capitalists, and what we get from it all is a growing inequality between the capitalist class and the working class, and an economy where our attention is literally being marketed. In fact, everything is being marketed. The whole point of neoliberalism is to essentially reduce everything down to a market analogy, and neoliberalism is what currently holds the reins on capitalism, and that's where a lot of the bullshit woke marketing stuff we have now comes into play. You want to make the world a better place? Buy our product. Anyway, that's why capitalism is bad, and if you want better explanations than what I've provided, please watch Non-Compete's video on why capitalism sucks, and literally any video by the economist Richard Wolff. So, again, back to our story. I had this pivotal moment of clarity where I realized the liberal Democrats were interested in propping up the same unjust and failing system that the Republicans want to maintain, and that this is why the same systematic issues hardly get touched on by either side. It became obvious that both sides were only interested in making money and suppressing any economic or philosophical ideologies that may interfere with them doing so. Anyway, I started watching some of these anti-capitalist videos and became interested in hearing about all the critiques and alternatives to the system we're currently under, and one of the most helpful channels was Zero Books. They poetically synthesize a lot of Marxist literature in a modern context that's pretty entertaining. And well, when I become interested in something, the first thing I do is buy some literature on the matter. So, I bought Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher and read through it, and it ended up being single-handedly the most influential bit of media I think I've ever come across. It's short, it's easy to read, it doesn't bullshit you with a bunch of clouded over-intellectualism, it delivers hard-hitting perspectives in an extremely simple and enticing manner, and it opened me up to what exactly our overarching economic structure does to us and our art. Then I read The Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch, where most of Mark Fisher's same sentiments were further elaborated upon, and I really enjoyed what the book had to say about the degree of alienation our modern-day society feels due to the way our system has developed to separate us from our labor and market everything to us while making us feel coddled, and how that's pushing us into our own worlds and ultimately making us more combative with one another. Read Chapter 2. I also really like what he had to say about the consciousness movement, and how that too has made us overly individualistic to the point of, well, narcissism. But after those two titles allowed me to dip my toes into those topics in general, I started reading more about the history and structure behind it all, and how critiques of capitalism and non-capitalist projects have always been constantly thwarted and disrupted by capitalists, basically since capitalism's inception. And as long as I'm throwing book titles out there, I read The Worldly Philosophers, The Lives, Times, and Ideas of the Great Economic Thinkers by Robert L. Heilbronner, Introduction to Political Economy by Charles Sacre, Jeffrey Schneider, and Janet Nodler, and Anarchism by Sean M. Sheehan. These books, along with some others, kind of helped flesh out my understanding of overarching social structures and how they can force us to act and influence us to do certain things. So I took the ideas from the things I was listening to and reading at the time and started talking to Mike about them, and this is what I've been doing for about the past year or so as I've started my journey towards the left. I've kind of grabbed Mike's hand and guided him towards the things that have influenced me into actual leftist thinking, and thus, his exposure to these ideas has led him, as well, to agree that the way we've conducted ourselves in the past may have been slightly problematic, and that a change is in order. I shared with him my unease at the thought of maintaining the cognitive dissonance of saying we have the utmost respect for the LGBTQ community and other disenfranchised communities, and how we want to create the most accepting atmosphere as possible, while also using slurs on our show. And we had a discussion about how no matter how these words are used, with neutral intention or with bad intention, they always end up enabling those who want to actually harm people. Mike agreed, and right now we're both trying our best to actively remain conscious of the vocabulary we use here on the show, and in our personal lives. So, TLDR, when Mike and I first made this show, we were some odd mix of centrist and liberal, and I guess we took the South Park mentality of equating and framing both sides as absurd, in an effort to appeal to a large crowd and come off as a sensible middle ground. But the middle ground of our Overton window is ultimately on the right, and we realized that to truly uphold the things we believe in, we needed to expose ourselves to and adopt more leftist thinking. And for the record, the left isn't more absurd. They're fighting for things like anti-authoritarianism and deconstructing unnecessary hierarchies, egalitarianism, which means protecting women's and minorities' rights, and workers' rights, and class consciousness, and same-sex marriage, consent, and they fight for environmentalism, since those most affected by pollution tend to be minorities. And I know right-wingers and centrists' favorite thing to do right now is bitch about how the left wants to destroy free speech, but here's the thing most of them don't understand, and it's really easy to grasp once you're introduced to this concept. There's no real thing as total freedom and equality of speech. It's impossible to protect everyone's speech equally. Some people's free speech fucks up the free speech of other people. Conservatives often say that leftists use labels like Islamophobe and homophobe in an attempt to take away their social credibility and silence them. But here's the thing. If they accept that words like those can cause some people to not want to express their opinions, then they should also see that Islamophobic and homophobic slurs themselves can have a silencing effect, causing people not to express themselves. ContraPoints and her videos on free speech gives an absolutely fantastic and elegant and infinitely more in-depth explanation on the complexities of freedom of speech that you should definitely check out if you have any contention with the way the left has been handling the topic. Anyway, like I said, this is us saying that we know we've appeared inconsistent on our channel, and we know we probably have made some people feel a little uncomfortable, and we want to say we're sorry. We've always loved LGBTQ people and minorities. Shit, one of our most popular guest hosts on the show, Alfonso, is a gay Hispanic American, and he's our best friend. We just didn't know how powerful words can be, and I owe people like ContraPoints and Non-Compete and Philosophy Tube, Zero Books, Richard Wolf, Angie Speaks, Aaron from Deadhead Animation, Sean, H Bomber Guy, David Packman, Cuck Philosophy, Hugo and Jake, Beau of the Fifth Column, Thought Slime, The Surfs, and many, many others for helping me along with my journey. And the journey's far from over. It doesn't end here. I know that Mike and I still have a ton to learn, and the transformation to betterment is a never-ending endeavor. So I thank you all for listening and having patience with us, and I hope you understand where we've come from. I think our story will do some people some good to hear, and that's why I've chosen to share it with everyone in this way. I think some people will find it relevant to them, and hopefully it'll help them on their own journeys. I'm ScowlingAl, we're the Podunk Punks, we love you, and I hope you'll join us for the ride.